Today on The State of Us, hiring challenges, wage gains, and immigrants in 2023. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined today by the one and only, your friendly redneck liberal and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance Jackson. Today, we're going to talk about unemployment rates edging down to match a half-century low of 3.5%, according to the latest jobs report. We'll also discuss how large pay gains are outpacing state minimum wages, which have been boosted for many workers, and how immigrants might be able to help relieve the labor shortage if Republicans and Democrats could focus on the real issues and quit using them as pawns. So there's a lot to discuss today.
What? The political parties are playing around with our lives and not doing what's best for us?
That doesn't
sound like
who'd
have thunk
them. So, Lance, what did we learn from the jobs report? It's supposedly pointing to a cooling labor market in 2023. Unemployment's at that half-century low of 3.5%. But what else did you find substantive?
Well, it's still up. It's still growing. The labor market's still growing, but not up as much. So the trend of growth is not as fast as it was before. It is the second best year of job creation after 2021, which was post-pandemic. We did add 4.5 million jobs in 2022. But because of some of the recent layoffs, it appears that the job market is cooling. However, I found this very interesting. Unemployment rate is predicted by some. It is currently at 3.5% in December, down from 3.6% in November. Some economists surveyed by the Wall Street Journal say there's a 63% probability of a U.S. recession in 2023. And that group of people who are predicting a recession say that unemployment could rise to 4.7% by December of 2023. My comment is, well, that's still historically low. I mean, I know I'm old, right? But here we are. We're painting a rather dreary picture with unemployment rates that I don't believe that I saw for the majority of my work history. I remember unemployment rates at 4, 5, 6% annually for most of the time that I was working. And again, that's anecdotal. I didn't look that up, but that's what I remember. Now I'm reading that, oh my gosh, Chicken Little, the sky is falling because we may have a 4.7 unemployment rate by December of 2023. And also, as we've stated here for the last year and a half on this show, the Labor Department reported last week that there were 10.5 million more job openings at the end of November than there are people seeking work.
Yeah, just for perspective, right? In October of 2009, at the height of the unemployment, quote unquote crisis, it was 10%. So, yeah, is 4.7% not good? Well, sure. Obviously 3.5% is better than 4.7%, but that's still half as bad as it was in 2000.
And that's my point. You asked me what I took from that, and it's like we're saying the sky is falling, and yes, it does show that the economy is struggling, but it's not like we've never been through this before, and just in my lifetime. We're not talking about, and they're talking about historic lows and things like that. We're not even talking 100, 200 years ago. To your point, we're talking 15 years ago. Or people, I guess it goes to that old thing that people always remember the past fondly because the human brain wipes out the negative stuff. We don't think about the negative things that were going on. But again, I remember in 1982, my parents had to buy a new car and they had to pay 12, 14, I think it was 12%, 12.7% interest rate for a car loan in 1982. And now everybody's like, oh, that cheap money's not there anymore. I can't get 0% financing. It's 3.9%. I mean, as I watch TV, it's like 3.9% or whatever. And I'm like, my God, my parents would have, given their right arm for a percent like that. And they had to buy a house in 1973 at a 7% interest rate. That was a government loan. It was, because my father had been in the military. So he got a government loan at 7% for the first house he ever bought. And now people are complaining because, it's complaining, I know, because of the comparison. But when you look at, people made it back then paying higher interest rates, I'm not so sure it's doom and gloom.
Because we don't want to experience things like we did, right, in 2008, 2009, and post, obviously, that, the Fed is definitely being cautious about, we've got to tamp down inflation. And we're going to do that even if it forces us into a hard landing, quote unquote, hard landing, which basically means, right, that we go into some degree of recession. Because that will, not to use a pandemic term, but flatten the curve, so to speak, right? It will level things out, because we don't want what could happen if inflation runs rampant. So instead, we'll take a little pain in the interim. But at the same time, it's like the numbers keep saying, well, really things are, they're not great, but like
they're worse than they were before. In the last 5 years. They're worse than they were 5 years ago. They're not bad when you look at the 20, 40, 60-year trend.
And I feel like you and I have been sounding this alarm bell for a while. Part of the problem, right, with inflation, and this isn't the Fed's fault because there's really nothing they specifically can do about it. But this is a lawmaker problem at the federal government level who could do something about it, which is part of this show, is unemployment's at 3.5%. Right? Which is the lowest it's been in 50 years. Okay. 50 years. It's not been that low, which is great. I mean,
see, I'm right. I don't ever remember
exactly.
seeing, I'm 61. So 50 years, that's about the time I would have started paying attention. I've never seen unemployment this low before.
Well, it hasn't been under 4%, Lance, since February of 2001. Like if you take out the pandemic, right? I mean, it's been 20 years almost since it was under 4% at all. And that was only, by the way, folks, just to be clear, that only lasted like 3 months at the start of like 2001. So it really wasn't, that was an anomaly because before that it was above 4%. And then we were at almost 6% from 2002 all the way through 2014. So, and we all thought that was
normal. That was status quo.
Yeah. So I guess, but the reason I'm bringing all that up is the thing that I think it keeps, I don't know if it's being overlooked as much as it's like our lawmakers just aren't doing anything about it, is the issue of how many workers are available and what does that do to inflation, right? Because if I'm a business and I'm growing and what I need is people to meet the demand and supply, I can raise prices, right? Causing inflation, so that hopefully that tamps down demand, or I can meet the demand and maintain, production levels and thereby hopefully prices as well, because I'm making more money if I'm selling more as well, right? So, and that's super simplified and again, not an economist, but it seems to me that if we had more people working, right, that this would help, given that like there are still twice as many job openings. Did you catch that, folks? Twice as many job openings as there are people who are looking to work. That's, I mean, and again, it's not we've said this so many times, it is not a 1-for-1. You can't just say, well, there's 10 million job openings and we got 5 million people out of work, so we only have to find 5 million more people. Well, no, because those 5 million don't just plug into 5 million jobs that are available automatically. It depends on what the jobs are and what sectors. So the point is that we don't have enough workers, and how am I defining workers? Somebody who wants a job, right? Who wants to work. That's what I'm talking about.
That's true. You're exactly right. But again, on any level, it's not as bad as that's my point. It's not as bad as it portrayed. Is it as good as it was? No. But why can't that be the outlier? Why is this the horrible thing and we have to be at, no inflation? Oh, because life's better that way. Okay, but that's not the way this system works. And if you study by this system, I mean capitalism / socialism, because if you're a longtime listener to this show, you know that the United States doesn't have true capitalism. Because yours truly, I'm fine with true capitalism, but people think this is hard. Take away Social Security, take away child benefits, take away subsidies to farmers, take away all those programs like that. Not the ones that just, don't save the ones that you like, but take away all of them. Then you come talking about true capitalism. And life is not good that way. Study your history.
And it's all about what we want. And one of the items to talk about, right, with hiring is also, which we alluded to at the beginning of the show, is what's going on with the minimum wage. Because that was something that you heard Lance and I talking about for a long time, raise the minimum wage. Okay, now we have more than half of the states in the U.S. are set to lift their minimum wages in 2023. Is it going to make any difference? Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. More than half of our states, Lance, are set to lift their minimum wages in 2023, but the effects could be muted because many low-income workers already earn more than the mandated amount due to strong labor demand. To illustrate this, through September of 2022, the lowest 10% of workers by income earned hourly wages that were on average 1/3 higher than their state's minimum wage. So the lowest 10% on average earned 33% more than their state's minimum wage, according to a Wall Street Journal analysis of data that was compiled by the Labor Department. In Minnesota, for example, these workers earned $14.50 an hour on average in 2022 through September. That's 40% above the state's current minimum wage of $10.33 and higher than the new minimum of $10.59 for large employers that's scheduled to take effect this month.
Are we really going to put more money in the working classes' hands by all this raising of state minimum wages?
It doesn't sound
like we will.
Not with the raises that are being impacted. Wages are growing very strong at the bottom of the pay scale, according to a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. That's not being driven by minimum wages, but rather by the tightness of the labor market. Almost sounds like what they're saying there is that when the labor market tightens, that helps lift wages. I don't want to say the minimum wage has become irrelevant, but it has certainly become less relevant, according to a professor at the University of California.
Well, what we're talking about is the remuneration of individuals. And remuneration. Yes, and don't be calling in and sending me saying, you got the wrong word, Jackson. It's remuneration. No, that's not the word, all right?
This is a different...
Remuneration is actually... Remuneration.
Okay, because you said
remuneration. The act or fact of paying an equivalent to for a service, loss, or expense, recompense, or pay. Example, the actor was offered a modest speaking fee by the host as remuneration for giving a speech at the awards ceremony. Now, whether it's because money is often expressed in numerals or simply because the letter N and M are adjacent to each other on our keyboards, remuneration often appears misspelled as remuneration. So I'm using the word correctly. If you've been using it and saying I'm wrong, you've been using remuneration, you're not using the word correctly, because remuneration, a very rare word, means the act of enumerating, counting or listing again. So when you pay someone for a service rendered, you are remunerating them. Remuneration.
Remuneration.
See, it's and again, but people flip, as I had always heard it, people flip the N and the M in that word, and it's like, oh no. So the correct usage is remuneration. And people are being remunerated at rates that we've never seen before, right? Which is why you could argue one reason for inflation. And talking here to Bobby Stuckey, who operates 2 restaurants in Denver and 2 more in Boulder, Colorado. He said he would voluntarily pay the higher minimum wage across 4 restaurants because that will be the fairest for all his employees, but customers will pay more, he said. And in Denver is boosting its own minimum wage to $17.29 an hour. The state of Colorado is increasing to $13.65. So also I want to point out that everybody thinks, oh, there's a national minimum wage. We all know about that. And then, by the way, it's like what, 7.25?
Yeah.
And hasn't been raised
since 2009.
But not only can states have a minimum wage, but certain metropolitan areas also have minimum wages. That's why in Colorado, the state minimum wage is $13.65, but in the city of Denver, it was raised this month to $17.29 an hour. So people are saying, hey, I'm going to pay that because, my workers deserve it, but understand that means it's going to become more expensive. But what I was looking for is this. Consumer prices rose 7.1% in November from the year before. After adjusting for inflation, average hourly earnings declined 1.9% over the same period for all private employees. So, you got that big 5 or 6% raise last year from your boss. Well, it's been eaten up and then some. So if you're thinking, why am I not able to buy the same things I was?
Why am I not better off?
Yeah, I got a big, huge raise. I'm bringing home more money. Well, that's where the inflation comes in. Okay. You maybe got a really good raise last year coming out of the pandemic, but you're not seeing that it's going as far as it did before. Your paycheck's not going as far as it did before because the cost of hiring and having people to work to produce the goods that you want to buy has gone up. So therefore, the price of those goods has gone up.
About a dozen states have automatically tied their minimum wage increases to inflation. So they automatically adjust. But that leaves the majority of the states that do not do that, right?
Which means every time there's inflation, the workers fall further and further behind. You fall further behind now, and 5 years from now, when this happens again, you're behind already, and you're going to fall even further behind. Hence, this is why we get to where we have this situation that many people just very easily refer to as the haves and the have-nots. This has happened within our system repeatedly, where people at the bottom continually stay at the bottom, but their money buys less and less and less and less and less. And that's where we get this big discrepancy in income, where we have, as we had a few years ago, the 1%ers, and the storming of Wall Street and everything else. You have 1% of the working class controlling over 90% of the money. And that happens when you don't do some kind of Robin Hood thing to where you make it so that these rich people have to give up their money somehow. For example, back when the middle class was at its strongest post-World War II in the 1950s, the highest business tax was over 80%, almost 90%, okay? And what that meant was these businesses like the Facebooks and the Zuckerbergs and the Amazons, they couldn't keep all the profit. They had to pay it to the government. So what did those big companies do? They didn't want to take all their hard-earned money and give it to the government. They gave their employees bonuses, Christmas bonuses, 6-month bonuses, raised wages. That's when the middle class was at the strongest. When you study history, historically it was when we raised the business rate. Now we don't do that because we say that would hurt the economy. Well, it hurts the ability of the richest group of Americans to make money. But a higher tax rate on business would mean they would have to share their profit with the workers or give it to the government. And I'm not a left-wing liberal. I'm just quoting history, people. Okay. When the middle class developed in the suburbs, that's what was going on within the tax rate.
So some math that I want to share with folks here, Lance, because you know how much I love
love you some math.
Love it.
Remunerate us some.
The reason that we've talked about a reform to the way that we think about minimum wage, right, is because of this notion that a federal minimum wage, I don't want to say that it's totally irrelevant, but it's really more of it's a floor, right? If you're going to have one, what it ought to be is a floor, because we've talked about this so many times. The notion that what Lance and I would pay, right, to rent a place in Urbana, Ohio versus what somebody in downtown Los Angeles pays, they're not even, and not just rent, right? But the food, the coffee, your gas, your car, everything that you buy almost, right? Very few things are unified in price across different living areas in this massive country that we're in. So to say that, well, what Lance and I need and what the person living in downtown LA needs are the same is just not true, because of the differences in cost of living in those places. So what we had proposed a while back was you can decide on what size you want to use, but just as an illustrative example, let's take the state of Ohio. In 2023, the average fair market rent for a 2-bedroom is about $800 a month.
And I know both of my daughters in the Cleveland area are paying $1,300 to $1,600 for a 2-bedroom apartment.
And that's where I want to illustrate the problem with even doing it on a state
level,
right? Because, for example, we know some people, right, like your daughters who are living in the Cleveland area who are paying way more than that. And we also know some people who are paying substantially less than that who live in the middle of nowhere in a super rural place. So the average, remember folks, the average is exactly what it sounds like. We took these numbers, and that doesn't mean that anybody's actually paying $800 for a 2-bedroom apartment. It means that the high and the low average out to be that. But even if you do that, you can say, okay, well, $9,600 a year, right, is what I would be paying average for rent in the state of Ohio. Well, $9,600 a year, if that's a third of what I'm supposed to make.
A third of your gross pay.
Right, a third of my gross pay, $9,600 times, 3. Again, not perfect here, but let's just, to keep it easy,
$30,000 a year is
right,
what you should make.
Yeah, $30,000 a year. So if I'm going to make $30,000 a year, working 50 weeks a year, you say, well, wait, there's 52 weeks in a year, right? But there's 10 federally recognized holidays. So let's cut out 2 work weeks. You're working 2,000 hours a year if you work a 40-hour work week, 50 weeks a year, 2,000 hours. Okay. So in other words, what do you need to be paid hourly in the state of Ohio on average to be able to afford the average rent, right? And these, again, we've talked about the flaws with all these averages, but this is some simple math here. $30,000
for 2,000 hours of work
divided by 2,000 is,
it's what, off the top of my head, it's $15 an hour.
Yeah.
See, no calculator, folks. I know you can't see it. It's radio, but in the internet, but it's $15 an hour.
Hardly anybody's getting the minimum wage in Ohio anymore. So it is hard to keep. It's $10.10 an hour as of January 1st, 2023. But it should be, according to quote unquote, the average, right? It should be closer to 15. Now, the minimum, and this is where we talk about what do you want from it? The minimum wage, think about the name, minimum, right? Would be the minimum to meet the living, what a living wage is. So you could say that, well, $10.10 an hour probably is there are people in Ohio who could theoretically live on $10.10 an hour. Can most people in the state of Ohio survive on $10.10 an hour? No, they cannot. Now, that's not me criticizing Ohio, because Ohio actually is one of those that, by the way, has a minimum wage that automatically adjusts. If some people can pay $600 and other people have to pay $1,300, or let's just call it $1,200 to keep it simple, that's twice the difference, right? So what I need to make in Cleveland versus, say, in Cable, Ohio, right, are not even, they're not even close.
Even though you're paying the same state taxes, and you're getting the same benefits from that said state, your money's only going half as far just when you talk about rent. You're not talking about gas prices and travel and insurance and everything else. And so therein, Justin, there's the problem, right? Is even if you do it statewide, you can have a huge difference among what it takes to have a minimum standard of living across the state.
So that $800 average, right, working out to needing to make somewhere in the neighborhood of $30,000 a year. Okay, well, that doesn't sound so bad, right? But let's switch to Cleveland, which is in the same state like we talked about. And I need $1,300 to get me that 2-bedroom. Okay, well, now we're talking about $15,600 a year instead of the $9,600 that we talked about before, right? And 15,000 times, not 3, but 3.33, right? Because if it's a third of our living, that's $51,948 a year, up from $30,000. So I need to make almost $22,000 more dollars a year to live in Cleveland than I do here. And again, using the same math, if we take $51,000 or $51,900 and divide that by 2,000 hours, we get $25.97. So you need to make $26 an hour in Cleveland versus $15 an hour average in the state.
And the bottom line is the state's only paying $10.10.
Right, yeah. And then the bottom line is the state's only paying 10, which there are probably a couple places in the state where you could actually do that. But the average person in the state can't do that. And the people living in the big areas can't do that. And then you would say, well, so why don't we raise everything to whatever the highest is? Well, now you're going to crush the small rural, cheaper living areas because they're going to be forced to comply with $25 an hour minimum wage, which they can't jump from. If they are truly paying $10.10 an hour, which there are some people that are, they can't over double somebody's pay and just be like, oh, it's no big deal.
Right.
That doesn't work either. The whole point in this is we're trying to illustrate the flaw in the way that our minimum wage system works federally, statewide. It's a problem when you don't adjust it on a more specific scale. It's a flawed notion of establishing this floor that really can't exist consistently because the floor is going to be so astronomically low in comparison to what some people are going to have in order to survive.
And remember, the federally stated minimum wage started during the Great Depression. So we've only had it since 1935. So actually 1938, if my memory serves. So we haven't always had a minimum wage. It's something that
it's a new,
in the history of our country,
thing.
We're still working with it, but it is a misnomer for sure.
And we've talked about ways you can solve that. I mean, a big way is adjusting the federal law to not, mandate a minimum floor, but require that, for example, based on a calculation that, the federal government agrees on, so many people per square mile, these geographic areas are required, like at the county level, the city level, right? Whatever already exists. And in some states, right, and I'm thinking here, folks, like if you get to some of our more sparsely populated states like Montana or something, maybe even at the state level, but definitely city, county, right? That type of thing, maybe even in big cities by borough, ward, neighborhood, right? That the federal law should require a standard factoring for wages, for cost of living, and then work wages backwards from there so that it's proportional and appropriate to the different areas of the country that people live in. So that Urbana, Ohio proportionally is equal to Los Angeles, California. That would be a more fair system. No, that doesn't mean that Lance and I are going to make the same thing working at McDonald's as somebody working at McDonald's in California, but proportionally we will make the same. A little simplistic, but let's talk about how do immigrants factor into any of this, Lance? Minimum wage, workers, etc. Where do they come into play? We have a very low unemployment rate. Wages are still going, and they're growing faster than minimum wages are being adjusted. Do immigrants play a role in this? Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. News coverage these days tends to dwell on asylum seekers, but some 70% of illegal border crossers are single adults simply looking for work. Now, I'm going to get on both Republicans and Democrats, so stick with us here, folks. Republicans worry about the U.S. becoming a welfare magnet for migrants, and there's always the chance that that could happen if Democrats do strive to expand the size, scope, and accessibility of government benefits. But they haven't done that yet. The overwhelming majority of people entering the country unlawfully are seeking employment, not handouts, and they have no viable legal option. A sensible border policy would provide ways for economic migrants to enter U.S. labor markets that are clearly struggling to find workers. But lawmakers, both Democrats and Republicans, are too busy using immigrants as political pawns. Public concern about illegal immigration has grown, and there is no Republican appetite for guest worker programs and amnesty proposals as long as border security is an afterthought. Democrats, meanwhile, have come to equate any border enforcement with xenophobia. And this is how we end up in this state of what Democrats and Republicans are talking about in the way of immigration really fundamentally has very little to do with the economic benefits of immigration and whether or not we're leveraging this to our advantage, which basically this article, I think, is trying to point out, Lance, we're not.
Right. Well, it's an opinion piece from the Wall Street Journal. And, you know, their point is well taken, is that both sides look at the border and the crossing of immigrants from that border in two totally different ways. And they're playing it up to their people, you know, to their voters in two separate ways. But the fact of the matter is the majority of people who are crossing illegally are looking to go to work.
7 out of 10.
And, you know,
are single and they want a job.
And I'll throw this in, the birth rate in the United States. And again, I remember I was talking earlier in the show about the 1950s, you know, the tax rate. In the 1950s, the birth rate per 1,000 people in the United States was 24. In 2019, the birth rate per 1,000 people is 11. So we're short workers because people are deciding not to have as many children. And while I'm not saying we should force people to have more children, the point is, and the point of this article is we have workers who are willing to come into the country and work. And another piece that this author points out is that if we allow that 70% to come in who are working, then Border Patrol would have fewer people to look at who are the ones that are making the news, causing the problem. Oh, we can't let immigrants come in because here's this illegal immigrant who committed a murder. So now if we let 2 million illegal immigrants in, we're going to have 2 million new murders in the United States, which is what the right wants to do. No, that's not right. And as this author points out, who typically is a conservative opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal, he points out, if we can filter it out, we filter it out and 70% are going to go get a job, then Border Patrol only has to check the 30% that could become possible problems, and we're more likely to stop those problems at the border.
Our country's literally founded on people immigrating from other countries.
Well, from the very beginning of our history, right? We needed people to chop down woods to build boats, so we brought in Scandinavians.
Right.
Well, the Democrats, you know, claiming xenophobia. No, the Chinese have a xenophobic country, and they had in the 80s and 90s, a one-child policy because they were worried about the birth rate. Now, if you read, the major problem for China in their economy is they don't have enough workers. Why? Because 40 years ago, they tried to control the population with laws concerning the number of births a Chinese family could have. And now that's come back to bite them in the butt 40 years later, because now they don't have enough workers and there aren't enough young people having children to replace the old people that are dying to work to keep the economy going. So they tried, you know, they are xenophobic. They don't want anybody in. They don't let immigrants in, and trying to control the birth rate doesn't work.
We've always talked about recency bias as a big problem, right? And if you think about, I mean, the majority of Americans alive today, right, remember very well probably the pain of 2008, 2009, and the following years and the recession. And when things go wrong, right, when things go bad, what we look to do generally as a people is figure out why. And that often equates to figuring out who to blame. Now, if there's 1 in 10 Americans can't get a job who want a job, right? and you have people coming in who are looking for jobs, what tends to happen is it becomes very easy to then contend, why would we be if our own people, right, if our own citizens can't get jobs that want jobs, why would we be allowing people who are not our citizens to come in and get jobs? At a very basic level, right, at a very basic level, that totally makes sense, except we don't have 1 in 10 Americans right now who can't get a job, right? We have something like 3 out of 100 who can't get a job. And we already identified that even if all those people went to work, there would still be more than twice as many jobs not filled. Now, you could say, well, like we talked about before, it's not 1 for 1. So simply allowing immigrants in is not going to simply address that problem. But what it can do is if you have underemployed workers, which we've talked about before, right? People who are working in jobs under their skill level. If we allow more immigrants who want to work, who are single and coming here because they want to work, which is, by the way, 70% of the illegal border crossings, according to that data, then they can take some of the jobs that would allow some of our underemployed people to take some of the jobs that maybe they're more qualified to take.
This is just, as this author points out, a common sense way and a way historically we have solved this problem of needing more workers. And even if it takes, and because there's been criticism, well, the backlog, it takes 2 to 3 months to get these people processed. Okay, that's still 3 times faster than someone becoming pregnant and having the baby, plus that baby can't immediately work.
Right.
You understand? So, I mean, I'm frustrated too that why is the government so inept that it takes so long to process somebody to get them in the, but doing it that way is still faster than
birthing a new human.
Right. And then waiting for that person to get old enough to be able to work.
The economy is going to crash before we could birth enough humans to fix the labor shortage. Right. I mean, that's just the reality.
And we had that in the late 1890s to 1910s. They were called birds of paradise. They were coming from Europe, coming here to work, sending the money back home. And after 10 or 15 years, they went back home. They didn't want to come to the United States and live forever, but this is where the jobs were. So they came here
to where the work is.
And when they worked for a while, and then they went back home. Yes, some of them stayed, but my point is, you study history, this is not an uncommon thing to have happen.
So why we have this conversation today, Lance? What was the point?
Well, because True Chat has a mission, and that mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we hope you've enjoyed today's show. Tell your family and friends about us. You can find us as a podcast on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
Podcast releases new episodes Tuesdays and Thursdays, first thing in the mornings. Those same episodes heard on the weekends on AM and FM radio stations across the United States. For The State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to producer Bradley Butch. Thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.